Estamos aquí hoy en la casa de Harold Bloom, uno de los lectores y críticos literarios más comprometidos del siglo XX y lo que va del siglo XXI. Controvertido, divertido, profundo. Esperamos que disfruten esta entrevista. Estuvimos 2 días con él, vinimos ayer, estuvimos un rato charlando y hoy vamos a hacer una segunda parte en su casa. Así que nada, disfruten muchísimo porque es un gran interlocutor para hablar de Shakespeare. Doing this?
Yeah, right about there, and she in your frame there, and you got it. Great. And if you just clap for us.
Okay. Let's talk about Shakespeare.
Yes.
In A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, or in Hamlet, it seems to me that Shakespeare uses the play within the play as a part of...
No, let's talk about this. I wrote a book called Hamlet, Poem Unlimited, which centers upon plays within plays within plays within plays. Mm-hmm. Because all of the drama of Hamlet is a series of plays within plays. And of course, not only A Midsummer Night's Dream, but fascinatingly, those strange little skits or plays that Howe and Falstaff play out in the first part of King Henry IV. Mm-hmm. I think Shakespeare is trying to teach us how to understand what acting is. These strange shadows. Macbeth cries out, "Life's but a walking shadow," a poor player that frets and struts upon the stage, and then is heard no more. Shakespeare's constant use of theatricalism, particularly the self-referentiality of the acting element in him. We must never forget that, like Molière, Shakespeare was an actor. Molière was still acting at the end of his life. He dies on stage, playing in one of his own dramas. Shakespeare seems to have given it up about the time, perhaps just before he wrote Othello and Measure for Measure. I think he'd gotten weary of it. But he always retains a kind of actor's perspective on what he's doing. And Hamlet, in fact, is practically a textbook in how to act and how not to act.
Mm-hmm. Which character in Shakespeare should we need to follow that is attractive and not a main character? You know, these characters who appear in Shakespeare, but they are not very important, but you find them very fruitful?
Barnardine in Measure for Measure, the convict who refuses, even though he's a confessed murderer, to be executed. Horatio in Hamlet, who seems to have no function except to represent us, the audience.
Yes.
Edgar in Lear. Enobarbus and Antony and Cleopatra. Ulysses and Troilus and Cressida. That's pretty much it.
That's pretty much it. Of the characters that represent us, the audience, we are the audience, and we have these characters who represent us like Horatio, and then we have characters who speak to the audience. Openly.
Very important. This is usually misunderstood. a number of Shakespeare's plays have epilogues in which the actor who had impersonated a particular part steps out in front of the curtain and addresses the audience directly. The actor has ceased to be the character, but is the actor himself.
Yes.
One thinks of Rosalind at the end of As You Like It. One thinks of Puck at the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream. One certainly thinks of Prospero at the end of The Tempest. And there are others.
And what about Richard III, when it says that he's addressing the audience to create this idea of, you know...
Well, that's a different phenomenon. He's simultaneously seducing and frightening the audience.
You cannot feel but liking somehow what he's doing, even though what he's doing is horrendous.
Well, it is like Iago, but Iago is a much grander figure. Iago has so sinister an attraction that it's very difficult for us to resist his blandishments. So what is the next question there?
Women in Shakespeare.
In general, in Shakespeare, all the women have to marry down. If ever a single writer has shown us that women are superior to men, it is William Shakespeare. All of the women who have to marry in Shakespeare are invariably superior to the men they marry. Even Rosalind, who's genuinely in love with Orlando and who's been bringing him up really to be more like herself. I cannot think of a marriage between equals in Shakespeare. Even Lady Macbeth, fearsome as Macbeth is a more intense and ultimately dreadful character. And the portrayals of deeply wounded and poignant women, Desdemona, Ophelia, Imogen, and Cymbeline.
Even in the comedies, right? When, for example, Helena says we are made to be wooed and are not meant to woo.
Yes,
this
well,
woman complaining about her position in society, right?
I think you could argue that Shakespeare implicitly urges the natural superiority of women. So another question there, please.
If you had to choose, I know this is a very difficult question. If you have to choose a line from Shakespeare that you say, this is the line I repeat myself, this is the line I come back to.
It is not so much a line as 2.5 lines. When the false friar, who's actually Duke Vincentio, is trying to urge Claudio to happily face execution, he says, "Thou hast nor youth nor age, but as it were an after dinner sleep, dreaming on both." The annihilation of the present moment is astonishing. Next question, please.
Which is for any reader who has never read Shakespeare before.
Yes.
Which is the play that they should enter first?
When I was young, we tended to use Julius Caesar for that. I think now I would begin with Romeo and Juliet, primarily because Juliet is such an extraordinary figure. When she cries out, "My bounty is as boundless as the sea," and the fact that her love is infinite, it's extraordinarily edifying and irradiating.
You said yesterday, Professor, that Shakespeare's main influence was himself. And I keep thinking about that. Yeah.
I meant two things by it. First of all, it is quite true that he is ultimately influenced by Ovid, Christopher Marlowe, the English Bible, and most of all by Geoffrey Chaucer, but that ultimately it is Shakespeare's influence upon himself that is crucial. That is to say, he is a prime instance of the influence of the mind upon itself. Go on.
All right. And what do you mean by the mind upon itself?
I mean that as his dramas unfold, he is always aware of his own previous work, and he seeks to subsume it, but also to transcend it, to go beyond it.
Mm-hmm. And there are two versions of Hamlet. There are two versions of Hamlet.
At least.
At least, that we can,
Yes.
trace. What are the main differences, if there are, between the two versions that we
Well, there are really
compare?
three versions of Hamlet. And there's also a lost Hamlet,
Yeah.
the so-called or Hamlet, which I think was written by the very young Shakespeare, but nobody knows. We know that it existed. Then there are basically three versions. There is the version presented in the first quarto, the one in the second quarto, and finally in the folio. Usually a so-called diplomatic text is used, which somehow amalgamates the three, but that really doesn't work very well. That would give you a play of more than 4,000 lines, of which Hamlet himself would speak 1,500. And that would take 5 hours, I think,
To perform.
to act upon a stage, even without intermission. And as you know, Shakespeare's plays were put on in the afternoon, since there was obviously no artificial lights, always without intermissions, without our act and scene divisions, and we're usually not expected to take more than about 2.5 hours. The second quarto is usually the preferred text. The first quarto is a very different play, and it's not at all clear if it was not sort of pirated or copied down by someone who got a lot of it wrong. The folio, the first folio, represents his final revision. So there's material in the folio, which is not in the second quarto, material in the second quarto, which drops out of the folio, and then first quarto is a world apart.
It's a world apart.
It's a very tangled textual history.
It is a very tangled text, yes. You said that for Hamlet, the self is an abyss, a chaos of virtual nothingness. This chaos of virtual nothingness, how much does it untangle the tragedy in Hamlet?
I think I differ from most Shakespearean critics, readers, teachers, in finding that Shakespeare, though in no way anti-Christian, pretty much ends up as a nihilist, far more extreme than anything that Nietzsche could have envisioned. Indeed, Nietzsche's sense of nihilism derives from Shakespeare. Hamlet in particular reaches a point, really quite early on, but certainly at the end, in which he says, "Since no man of aught he leaves knows aught, what is it to leave betimes? Let be," meaning nobody knows anything about anyone else, or even ultimately herself or himself. And therefore, it doesn't really matter when you die. You've sort of known death already. And Hamlet really is death's ambassador to us, just as Falstaff is life's ambassador to us. Hamlet increasingly chooses nothingness, non-existence, and ends by saying, in every meaning of the remarkable phrase, "The rest is silence." I also don't say that anyone could really know the drama of King Lear or of Macbeth without realizing that you end in a kind of total vision of nothingness and meaninglessness. What's the next question?
You said in one of your books that the plays remain as an aesthetic, cognitive, moral and spiritual achievement in these four categories that define them as canonical and fundamental for the description of the human condition.
Well, what I derive ultimately from Shakespeare is my sense that sublime literature, high literature, authentic literature is marked by three stigmata, as it were: aesthetic splendor, original and profound cognition, and wisdom. Shakespeare increasingly abounds in all three.
And if you have to, for example, which one is the most aesthetic one? Above all aesthetic.
I would suppose it's the aesthetic splendor, it's the fact. The crucial word to use in regard to Shakespeare, which he himself favors, is wonder, W-O-N-D-E-R.
Mm-hmm.
It is all a mode of wondering, of a kind of humane speculation which goes out to the frontiers of thought, sensibility, and feeling. Mm-hmm. So what's the next question?
And what is the role or the function you find in dreams and nightmares in Shakespeare? Dreams and nightmares.
Oh, well, it's endless. Prince Hal viciously says, with Falstaff down on his knees at the end of Henry IV, Part 2, "I know thee not, old man, how ill white hairs become a foal and jester. I oft have dreamed of such a man, so surfeit swelled, but being awaked, I do despise my dream." A dream seems to be a curious combination of dissimulation and authentic nightmare. Lady Macbeth cannot sleep because as soon as she tries to fall asleep, she dreams about the dead King Duncan and the blood pouring out of his wounds.
His dreams.
And the most beautiful description of a dream in Shakespeare is Mercutio and Romeo and Juliet.
Yes.
His vision of Queen Mab, the queen of the fairies. And of course, A Midsummer Night's Dream is indeed a dream. Very difficult to know where the representation of reality and a waking vision or a dream intersect in that play. But that's very frequent in Shakespeare.
It is, yes. And fate? I remember, for example, when Hamlet tells Horatio, we defy augury. We
Yes.
defy augury. Many characters in Shakespeare can predict, can feel what's going on. Romeo,
Well,
when
the
he goes...
soothsayers speak to them.
Uh-huh.
Thus, Julius Caesar, in the play of that title, the soothsayer notoriously says to him, beware the Ides of March, when in fact he will be assassinated. A soothsayer says to Antony and Cleopatra, stay away from Octavius, because in his presence your genius abandons you.
What is this defiance?
Macbeth himself
Yes.
lives in a kind of borderline realm of quasi-hallucination. In the famous monologue, is this a dagger which I see before me? He's having a vision, it isn't actually there. And he powerfully calls it, one of the great phrases in Shakespeare, a dagger of the mind. Hamlet, and certainly the greatest soliloquy in all of the world, says, to die, to sleep, to dream. Aye, there's the rub. From that sleep of death, what dreams way come. And then you get the dreams which would be a kind of nightmare, even though supposedly you're dead. But it's endless.
It is endless.
What's the
And
next?
madness?
Madness. Hamlet simulates madness. And perhaps at certain moments he crosses over into it and comes back again. Ophelia does go mad because of him and drowns herself. Leontes goes into a madness of jealousy in The Winter's Tale. Othello really becomes both paranoid and pathologically extreme indeed. He goes over the verge. Edgar simulates madness in King Lear. Lear indeed himself does go mad and goes in and out of the very clothes he is in. Again, there are too many instances.
Yes, there are too many. It's a key issue for me in madness. How do crime and punishment revolve in Shakespeare? Crime and punishment.
No, that is to bring morality to Shakespeare. He's not interested in that.
He's not.
Macbeth becomes a vicious criminal, murdering children. And yet, so amazing is the energy of his being and above all his language that we are unable to disengage ourselves from him. So much so that Shakespeare wisely has him killed by Macduff off stage, only then his head is brought in. Edmund in King Lear, having gotten his death wound from his half-brother Edgar, lies upon the ground and says, the wheel is come full circle, I am here. And he cries out, I pant for life. Some good I mean to do despite of mine own nature. He makes a last attempt to save Cordelia and Lear, but it's too late for Cordelia. In one of the great Shakespearean sonnets, Shakespeare speaks of the fools of time who die for virtue, but who live for crime. Let's take the next question.
You said that Falstaff's matrix is freedom, but then he dies for love. What has been your matrix, Harold?
My wife.
Today is the 23rd of April, and the world is celebrating the Day of the Book in honor of Cervantes and Shakespeare. What would you tell the people who are watching you books have been for you? What have they been for you personally? What have they been? Why should we read? Why are we celebrating books today?
The enhancement and enlargement of human life, the efflorescence of humane contemplation, the deep desire to know both one's own self and the self of others. Nothing in the end can bring this to any of us, finally, except the greatest writers, Homer, Plato, Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Milton, Goethe. I left out Montaigne, Molière, Tolstoy, Ibsen, Proust, Joyce, Kafka, Peckett, and so many more. They do not teach you how to live or what to do. They teach you inwardness. So, one more question. Make it the final one, okay?
I will. For me, that was the most beautiful one. How much of a Falstaff have you been?
Me?
Yes. You're so much in love with the character. What makes...
As of this morning, I weighed 152 pounds. I think when I first met my wife, I must have weighed 210, 215. I was also, though very awkward, very exuberant. I laughed more than I laugh now. I don't know that I understood life then, and I certainly don't understand it now. I had a tiny trace of his exuberance, only a small trace of his wit, maybe a measure or two of his enormous vitality. But now, going on 87, there's nothing Falstaffian about me, which is why I find it ironic That charming cartoon
Yes,
and the book review,
in the book review, if
in which, as my wife remarks,
it's him.
some version of my former continence appears, but that's not me anymore. So let's have a
But
final.
essentially, it's you.
What there?
Anyway, essentially, it is you.
What, child?
It is essentially you, anyway.
More or less.
More or less.
So a really final question that I must go down the hall.
All right. Which is the most memorable performance of Shakespeare you can recall?
No question about it whatsoever. I talk about it in my new book, Falstaff, Give Me Life. In the late summer of 1946, soon after my 16th birthday, I attended on 2 consecutive evenings at the Century Theater in New York, the Old Vic Company. The first night they played Henry IV Part 1, the second Henry IV Part 2. Ralph Richardson, the most magnificent of actors, the one whose photograph appears on the cover of my book, played Falstaff. In Henry IV Part 1, Laurence Olivier played Hotspur. Then a stunning transformation in the second part of the play. He played Justice Shallow, that forked radish of a shriveled up version of a man. And there are many fine actors on the stage. I remember Harry Andrews.
What made it that special? What did they get from Shakespeare?
It was put on as Shakespeare would have wanted it put on. Absolutely straight, following the text. It was glorious.
It was glorious.
I have never seen anything in a theater since then, though my wife recently kindly brought me the tape of Orson Welles' Chimes at Midnight, which is a lovely film with a magnificent performance by Orson Welles, who's of course the director, as Falstaff, with a charming performance by Jean Moreau as Dowell Tearsheet, a hilarious one by the great Margaret Rutherford as Mistress Quickly, fascinating performance by the third great Shakespearean actor with Richardson and Olivier, John Gielgud, as King Henry IV, and a haunting performance by an actor I believe named Keith Baxter? Keith Mitchell? I haven't seen much of him, but he's very good as Howell, who becomes Henry V. All right, dears, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't go until I come back so I can
We won't go.
properly say goodbye.
We won't go.
Allow me to express my gratitude for your funding of my interview and my, I suppose you could call it, question and answer lecture appearance. I hope that this can be done again at reasonable intervals. Period. One of my great regrets is that I have never been able to visit Argentina, even though I was given an honorary degree in absentia by the University of Buenos Aires. Thank you very much.